systems and the penal code are, and that mathematical concepts are man-made, just as ethical values, traffic rules, and bird cages are man-made. These are quotations from the anthropologist. I wouldn't think about bird cages when discussing the nature of numbers, but I'm faithful to my sources. And he says, mathematics in its entirety is its truth and its realities is part of human culture, nothing more. Mathematical truth exists in the cultural tradition into which the individual is born and so enters his mind from the outside. But apart from cultural tradition, mathematical concepts have neither existence nor meaning, and of course cultural traditions have no existence apart from the species. Mathematical realities thus have an existence independent of the individual mind, but are wholly dependent upon the mind of the species. So, expressed on this very general level, it sounds great, but it needs a more careful argument. A variant of the cultural view more as a kind of a social construction is has no significant support in the mathematical community. A classical reference is the book The Mathematical Experience by Davis and Hurst. There is also a more recent book by Hurst arguing this point of view. A recent voice in support of this view is David Mumford in a lecture from 2000. But again, these are more expressions of opinion. For a more carefully argued account of mathematics as a social construct, I make a reference to work by a young mathematician, Cole, from 2008, and also some forthcoming work. And I should have liked to, but I cannot, make a reference to the thoughts of Saul Pfefferman on the same issues. These are views that he has had for the last 20 years, more or less, and it is about time that it is now presented more carefully and fully to his fellow mathematicians. Well, all of this, I mean, there has been a great deal of criticism against this social constructivism from philosophers of mathematics. They have not always been convinced by this approach, and I have references to several critical accounts by philosophers to that point of view. In a sense, one feels that philosophers of mathematics has become a bit too protective of their domain and do not look very favorably upon people trying to inject into this domain bits of science from other domains. I think Pat would agree with me on that point. I presented this work in a seminar in Oslo under the leadership of Føllestad, and then of course I was immediately, they all immediately drew upon me all of Husserl and his view on the foundation of mathematics. And it is quite clear that he, among philosophers, seems to have a very coherent and I would say in many respects a very attractive philosophy of mathematics. But nevertheless, I'm not prepared to give up on this cultural approach. The main problem with the cultural approach was, as expressed by Husserl, is that mathematical objects cannot be assimilated to social or cultural objects because social and cultural objects are bound to times and places. That is a main point. And at this point I would like to make reference to the work of Richard Kitson, and he has his own work, but he has also written an excellent survey of Husserl's philosophy of mathematics in the Cambridge companion volume on Husserl. I very much recommend that article. So, let me go back to, let me still somewhat stubbornly insist on the cultural view. How could the cultural view be strengthened to meet the criticism of Husserl? This is a question I'm saying a few words about. We agree that numbers are abstract objects, but how are they related to brain and mind? I shall, in this paper, I first approach this question by discussing the evolution of language and how syntactic categories such as noun phrases and verb phrases became object of the collective mind. I mean, the anthropologists, 5 minutes, distinguish between 3 kinds of objects: the matter and mind, the individual mind, and then you have the abstract objects, and in the colorful language, the collective mind of the species, and that is where numbers are. I cannot here, since Sol already signaled to me that there are only a few minutes left, 5 minutes left, go into this example of syntactic category. But it's very interesting, because the argument there is not a neural argument in itself, from, that you have it, but it's an evolutionary argument. You can formulate, and it was done by Martin Nowak and collaborators in a paper some years ago in Nature, a theory that explains the evolutionary advantage of splitting up messages in an NP-VP form. And since there is a kind of a common view of the world in objects and acts and properties of objects, this seems to give syntactic categories a kind of universality and invariance over various cultural differences. This is very much different from word order, which we know, again, recent work, is very much dependent on cultural context. If we come to numbers, there has been a much current interest among neuroscientists on how mathematics is related to brain structure. In the paper, I review much of this work, but I'm not entirely convinced by that kind of work, that there exists a certain mathematics gene there from eternity to eternity. It seems also that for numbers, we would try to seek a similar explanations as we had for syntactic categories. And then we don't start with the mathematics of the Greeks, but we do, as Pat did in his paper, go all the way back to bones and strings and stones and these early examples of being able to handle quantities 1, 2, and more, and then try to trace a history of how this developed. I mean, there is a lot of knowledge, of the development of, obviously, the non-European roots of mathematics, and that is highly relevant for this story, in the same way as the references Pat made to the development of geometry. So I think that, but what is also interesting is the question, which also maybe is that the relationship between the environment and the individual, the genetic makeup. I mean, today one is much more willing, and I can refer you to 2 excellent survey papers, one in Nature and one in Science, quite recently, just the last one just a few months ago, on causalities in more complicated biological systems. And how you have a two-way trade between inheritance and outside influence. And it's quite clear that with the invariance, say, of syntactic categories and of numbers, and they had a survival value, then those who survive would have a genetical basis for having these things. This, in a way, is a counter-argument to Chomsky's views on the origin of grammar. In my view, the semantics is primary, and the syntax is secondary. But when the syntax becomes fixed in the surviving individuals, you might be led to think that they are the primary thing. But it is a co-evolutionary fact. 1 minute? Yes. I should now enter into a long discussion of how this kind of view leads to Pat's view of why the applicability is not unreasonable, or in my words, that the obvious applicability of mathematics. But and that I cannot do in 1 minute. I must say that I wrote this without knowing of Pat's last paper, but I sent a copy to him and got a very, very extensive reply. And we are now entering into a dialogue on the nature of mathematics, and we hope to continue that. In fact, we are looking forward to receiving, beyond this 90th birthday and all these celebrations. He will come to Oslo later this year, and we will sit down and discuss this further, concentrating on structure and algorithms. The main point of disagreement between us is whether the things we observe are really objects or just patterns of reasoning. This reminds us of the famous Abram Robinson Gödel's discussions about infinitesimals, which was mentioned in the title, but not here. Okay, thank you, and thanks.